on that basis, Mr Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This bill represents a disingenuous and confused government when it comes to the issue of student loans and student support. Disingenuous, Mr Speaker, because despite all the high-minded rhetoric about the importance of getting loans paid back, they know that by doing this, it'll affect very few loans. They'll get very, very little money back as a result of this bill, but are waving a giant big stick around that will have the effect of saying to many young New Zealanders overseas, don't come home. Don't bother, we don't want to see you, we don't want your contribution. So on the one hand, it's the big, proud Paul Goldsmith standing up saying, we're not going to stand up for loan defaulters. All through the documentation, we're not really going to use it. So in other words, it's disingenuous. They're trying to look good. It's a gimmick, Mr Speaker. It's not a proper policy to see student loans paid back. It's not a proper policy to talk to young New Zealanders overseas and say, come back home and contribute to your country. It is a disingenuous gimmick from the National Party to look like they're being tough on loan defaulters, to look like they're doing something about getting student loans paid back, and in reality, all they are doing is putting in front of New Zealanders a gimmick. This is a government out of touch with those New Zealanders who have that debt overseas. And I think all members of Parliament will have received communication from people affected by this legislation. And the overwhelming message from young New Zealanders overseas to us in those communications is, this is putting me off coming home. This is saying to me, why should I come back to my country? And this government, if they were really serious about getting student loan debt repaid, would be looking at other sorts of arrangements, which we discussed in the Select Committee, Mr Speaker. For instance, actually having a repayment regime that's about what people living overseas can afford to pay. Not some arbitrary measure which has been set in this bill, but rather an earnings-based assessment. Now, we were told by the officials, oh, that's too difficult. Well, it's not, Mr Speaker. For the vast majority of people who are living in countries where we have agreements that could facilitate that, and we do. We're talking here about Australia, the United Kingdom. It is actually perfectly possible to come up with a regime that is about what people can afford to pay. One of the most common things we hear is it's too complicated and it's too much money. It's not a realistic assessment of what someone is earning and their outgoings overseas. A government committed to getting repayments would actually sit down and work out a regime where that could happen. But instead, they want to come up with a policy which, frankly, as well as being disingenuous, is unworkable. Now, at this point in the debate, I would love to be able to refer to the pros and cons of this idea from the regulatory impact statement. There are a variety of options proposed for what could be done to increase repayments, and the pros and cons for this particular one, border restrictions, aren't here. Aren't in the regulatory impact statement. They've been withheld from here. So the National Government doesn't actually want us to know what were the arguments for and what were the arguments against this, because they just want to come to the House and say, agree with this gimmick, it'll sound good, sounds like we're doing something about it. Well, Mr Speaker, that is simply not good enough. It is not good enough to expect this House to agree to a provision that fundamentally changes what has been a civil matter, the repayment of loans, and turns it into a criminal matter. That is a serious change. If the National Government wants parties in this House to support that, it should at least come with some evidence. It should at least come and say, this is why we think this will work. But instead, the regulatory impact statement is completely silent on the pros and cons, or in particular the cons, of this proposal. That is because it's not really designed to work. It's actually designed as a gimmick. And in what is in the paper as they make the case for this option, or they outline this option, is the fact that it says, here, I'll just read you a piece from this. Think about how this will work. Once the borrower is located at the airport, police would make a judgment as to whether to execute the arrest warrant or not. It is important for police to use their discretion, and the decision to make an arrest may have consequences for other passengers, the airline and airport security. It may not be appropriate, for example, to arrest a single adult accompanying a young child if adequate arrangements can't be made for the child. Oh, well, maybe if we make arrangements for the child, we'll just go around and arrest people. This is ridiculous policy, Mr. Speaker. It sounds like a farcical situation, and the police have told us quite clearly they don't have the resources to be sitting at the airport trying to work out whether to arrest people or not. It is a farcical policy, Mr. Speaker, without proper justification. What the government could actually have done here was talk about what it could, in this bill, was talk about what it could do to make the student loan scheme fairer. Because, Mr. Speaker, while this bill has been winding its way through Parliament, the government has made a number of changes to the student loan scheme and the student allowance scheme. They've abolished postgraduate allowances. No postgraduate student in New Zealand can now get allowances. And along with a number of other members of this House, I've been visiting university campuses over the orientation period, and I have been told at our two largest universities there has been a significant impact on the number of postgraduate enrolments. And for those people who can continue to do postgraduate study, there is a massive increase in debt because they will be having to use a student loan scheme that does not adequately fund their living costs. And in fact, for a number of people, particularly among the psychologists, architects, ophthalmologists, those who have to do postgraduate qualifications in order to practice, a number of them are leaving, going overseas, because once again, the government is saying, no reason to stay in New Zealand. We don't value a postgraduate qualification if you are not rich enough to be able to pay your way yourself. That is not good enough, Mr. Speaker. So that happened while this bill was going through the House. Also, what happened with the restrictions on access to loans and allowances based on age. If you're over 55 years old, you can't borrow the living costs of the student loan scheme, limiting the opportunities for people to retrain. If you're over 40, under this national government, 3 years of allowance for 3 years entitlement for allowances through your whole lifetime, retrospectively applied as well. So if you got 3 years of allowances in your 20s, you worked, you lose your job, you think, I need to retrain, I need to do something so I can contribute to the economy. This national government says, we don't value you. You can't have an allowance. You have to apply for a loan that you won't be able to afford to live on. Is true, Mr. Hayes. Read your own policy, Mr. Hayes. No allowances if you're over 40 if you've had 3 years. But it goes on, Mr. Speaker. It goes on. It used to be that when you came to New Zealand as a new migrant, you had 2 years in which you had to wait before you could draw on the student loan and support scheme. Now it's 3 years. And where I have had people in my office who want to be training and contributing to New Zealand, who've migrated to New Zealand, who want to start a life here, and they're not able to do that because of the policy of this government. So while this bill has been going through the House, Mr. Speaker, access to the student loan and allowance scheme has been cut back. The government's introduced an administration fee on the student loan scheme because they weren't brave enough to reintroduce interest on student loans, which we know that they want to do. So they put an administration fee, another additional cost. So, Mr. Speaker, we could have been having a conversation in this Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill number 3 about how we use the student loan scheme to get more people into tertiary education, to give more people the opportunity to benefit themselves and their communities and their families. But instead, we have a silly, gimmicky, disingenuous policy that criminalises a whole lot of New Zealanders, that sends a message to those New Zealanders overseas, don't come home, don't come back to contribute to your country. Well, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe this is a backward step. It's a silly policy. What we should be doing is saying to New Zealanders overseas, there will be opportunities for you, and I can assure those people overseas and their families here in New Zealand who are listening today, Mr. Speaker, that under a Labour-led government, we will ensure that the student loan and allowance scheme actually works to encourage people into education. Stephen Joyce has said he wants to dampen demand for tertiary education. I want to see enrolments increase, qualifications increase, and the tertiary education system contributing to a positive future for all New Zealanders. Under this government, it is a total failure. This bill is a ridiculous gimmick, and we will oppose it.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.